Hello and welcome. I'm James Azimoha. You're watching A News. Let's see your headlines. Iran and Israel exchange fire in a new escalation. European leaders and Ukraine agree conditions for a just and lasting peace deal with Russia. And Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan declares victory in parliamentary election to secure another term in office. Tensions between Iran and Israel have sharply escalated following a new exchange of strikes that are threatening efforts to secure a wider regional ceasefire. Meantime, U.S. President Donald Trump has asked Israel not to retaliate while urging Iran to come to the negotiating table.
Iran launched multiple waves of missiles towards northern Israel on Sunday, marking its first direct attack on Israel since the April truce, which Tehran said was in retaliation for Israeli strikes on the outskirts of Beirut earlier that day. Israeli defense systems intercepted most of the missiles, according to the military. Explosions and air raid sirens were reported in Haifa and other areas of northern Israel, although there were no immediate reports of significant damage. The Iranian attack reportedly involved 4 missile barrages, according to the Israeli military, and targeted the Ramat David air base in northern Israel. Iran's Revolutionary Guard warned of further attacks if Israel continues its strikes.
Despite the previous warnings of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the child-killing Zionist regime has targeted Beirut's Zahieh by crossing all red lines and increasing attacks in southern Lebanon. We had previously warned that if the crime in the suburbs of Beirut expands, we will attack targets in the occupied territories. The Zionist army must stop its attacks on southern Lebanon and the suburbs, and if it expands its attacks on that region or responds to Iran's actions, it will face more crushing and regrettable blows, and destructive attacks will begin against the regime and its supporters.
The missile barrage came after Israel carried out airstrikes on military targets in western and central Iran and launched attacks on Beirut's southern suburbs earlier in the day. The Israeli military said the Beirut strikes targeted Hezbollah-linked sites in response to cross-border fire into Israeli territory. Local media reported that 2 apartments in separate buildings were hit in Beirut's southern suburbs, which, according to Lebanese health authorities, killed at least 2 people and injured around 20 others. Other Lebanese sources said a wider wave of Israeli strikes across Lebanon killed 11 people and wounded 44.
What's your position?
U.S. President Donald Trump had urged Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu not to retaliate against Iran, criticized the strikes on Beirut, and said Iran's missile attacks would not help ongoing negotiations. Iran has repeatedly said any agreement with Washington depends on a ceasefire holding in Lebanon. However, Sunday's Israeli strikes on Beirut have raised fresh doubts about prospects for a broader regional settlement.
Now, Iran has warned Israel against retaliating after the Revolutionary Guards said they fired a barrage of ballistic missiles at an airbase in northern Israel. Tehran says the base was used to launch Israeli raids on Lebanon and warned that any response could trigger further escalation. Turaj Shivalilu has more.
The Iranian Foreign Ministry warned in a statement on Monday that any military operation by Israel against Lebanon or Iran would meet Tehran's forceful and comprehensive response. The statement was issued after Iran's Revolutionary Guards, IRGC, announced late on Sunday that its aerospace force targeted an Israeli airbase by ballistic missiles in retaliation for the attacks on Lebanon. It said Israel's attacks on Lebanon was a breach of the 8th of April ceasefire deal between Iran and the U.S., adding that the missile attacks were carried out in compliance with Iran's inherent right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. According to an IRGC statement, its aerospace force fired missiles at Israel's Ramat David airbase in response to the widespread military operation in southern Lebanon and the suburbs of capital Beirut. The Revolutionary Guards said that Sunday night's missile raid was a warning and that if Israel continued its strikes in Lebanon, all Israeli and U.S. targets would be included on the force's list of attack targets. Meantime, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi held separate phone calls with his counterparts from UK, Turkey, France, Qatar, Egypt, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, as well as Pakistan's army chief, whose country is mediated an extended ceasefire agreement between Tehran and Washington. The contacts were made on Sunday and early Monday, following Iran's missile attacks, which coincided the 100th day in the Israel-US war with Iran on 28th of February. Araghchi stated that Tehran had warned Israel to cease its military operation in Lebanon. On Sunday, Araghchi also met Pakistan's Interior Minister Mohsen Raza Naqvi, during which the visiting official delivered the special letter of Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif to Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Sayyid Mujtaba Khamenei. Sunday night's ballistic missiles attack were carried out on the eve of the 12-day war's first anniversary, which falls on coming Saturday. On 13th of June last year, Israel attacked Iran and was later joined by the U.S. bombing of Iran's 3 major civilian nuclear sites under the UN safeguards. In the latest development, the IRGC Aerospace Force said on Monday that it launched a missile operation by targeting the strategic air bases of Nevatim and Tel Nof in response to Israel's attacks on radar sites in 3 parts of Iran. Turad Shiralilu from Tehran for A News.
Now, U.S. President Donald Trump said that Israel and Iran are moving toward an immediate ceasefire while talks continue on a broader peace deal. In a post on Truth Social, he also said final negotiations are ongoing, but warned they could be affected by what he called ignorance and stupidity. The escalation has made U.S.-led peace efforts harder and pushed oil prices up by nearly 5%, with Brent crude rising above 97% or $97 a barrel. Now, the European Union has imposed sanctions on 2 Iranian individuals and a unit of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, accusing them of threatening maritime freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. EU Foreign Policy Chief said member states in Brussels approved the measures under a new sanctions regime focused on protecting freedom of navigation, adding that further action could follow if needed. Kai Kallas made these remarks to reporters at a meeting of EU defense ministers in Cyprus. The informal gathering focused on current and emerging security challenges under the Cyprus EU Council presidency.
Freedom of navigation is under heavy pressure globally, as we see most acutely in the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran effectively closed the strait, and its drones continue to threaten the maritime traffic. Ministers were clear today that Iran's actions are unacceptable. In response, EU member states in Brussels today approved sanctions against the Iranian individuals and entities involved in disrupting the transit through the Strait of Hormuz. And this is the first time EU has applied its new freedom of navigation sanctions regime, and where necessary will apply it again.
Now, Chinese President Xi Jinping has arrived in Pyongyang for a 2-day state visit, where he is set to hold summit talks with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The visit is Xi's first visit to North Korea in 7 years. Our correspondent Manu Makdum has more.
President Xi received a grand welcome upon his arrival in the North Korean capital on Monday. Kim Jong-un and First Lady Ri Sol-ju greeted President Xi at the airport, with a grand ceremony later held at the Kim Il-sung Square, featuring a cavalry escort, a 21-gun salute, and crowds waving flowers and flags. The visit comes as China and North Korea seek to deepen strategic communication and strengthen bilateral ties. Ahead of his arrival, Xi published a commentary in North Korea's state newspaper, pledging unwavering friendship and vowing to deepen cooperation across multiple areas, including the military. No specific agenda has been disclosed, but experts say that the meeting is expected to have significant ramifications for bilateral ties and beyond, as both sides seek to fully restore their traditional alliance in the face of separate confrontations with the United States. North Korea is expected to press for economic concessions and potentially seek Beijing's tacit recognition of its nuclear status. Days before Xi's visit, North Korea unveiled a new facility for producing nuclear bomb ingredients, and Kim has vowed to expand the country's nuclear forces. China, meanwhile, is likely to seek Pyongyang's alignment on security matters and push back against what Beijing views as Japan's increasingly assertive defense posture. Analysts say Xi's decision to make Pyongyang his first overseas destination of 2026 shows the level of significance Beijing attaches to shoring up this relationship at a time when North Korea's deepening ties with Russia have complicated China's traditional role as Pyongyang's primary patron. The talks are being closely watched for signals on denuclearization, regional security, and the future direction of China-North Korea ties in a shifting regional landscape. Manu Maktoum, A-News, Beijing.
Now, the UK Prime Minister has stepped up pressure on major tech firms over online child safety. He's warning companies they must act quickly or face new legislation. Our correspondent reports from Manchester.
Prime Minister Keir Starmer has given tech giants Apple and Google a 3-month deadline to introduce software that blocks explicit images on children's phones or face new laws forcing them to do so. Speaking at a London Tech Week, Starmer said companies must activate nudity detection systems or similar tools across smartphones and tablets to prevent minors from creating, sending or receiving sexually explicit images unless verified as adults. He warned that if firms fail to comply by September, the government will bring forward legislation to make these protections mandatory on all devices sold in the UK. The Prime Minister said too many have accepted their idea that nothing can be done to stop children sharing explicit content, calling that view unacceptable. He insists that technology must adapt to society, not the other way around, and said online predators must be stopped from exploiting young people through their devices. The move follows growing political pressure over child safety online, including the resignation of former Safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips, who accused the government of delaying stronger action to prevent children creating and sharing explicit images of themselves. The government says it wants the UK to become the first country to effectively block children from taking, sending or viewing nude images on phones. The companies have already introduced limited tools, such as a warning system for sensitive content, but ministers argue these are not strong enough because they can often be bypassed. Zaina Farizadeh, A-News, Manchester, United Kingdom.
Now, the leaders of Britain, France and Germany have backed Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's proposal for direct talks with Russia's President Vladimir Putin during a meeting in London. The diplomatic push comes as Kyiv and Moscow continue to exchange long-range strikes.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and French President Emmanuel Macron in London on Sunday to discuss support for Ukraine and possible steps towards ending the war. European leaders and Ukraine have agreed on 5 key conditions for what they describe as a just and lasting peace deal to end the war with Russia. They backed a proposal for direct talks between Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin, with European and US participation, and called for an immediate ceasefire as the basis for negotiations. The leaders also discussed Ukraine's military needs, including additional air defense missiles, following some of the largest Russian air raids on Ukrainian cities in recent weeks. The talks followed Zelensky's recent proposal for a direct meeting with Putin, which the Russian president rejected, saying conditions were not yet in place for meaningful negotiations. Meanwhile, attacks were reported on both sides overnight. Russian drone attacks struck Kharkiv, with local authorities reporting multiple impacts as damage assessments continued. On the Russian side, Moscow-appointed authorities in occupied Crimea said a Ukrainian drone struck a passenger train early on Monday, killing an assistant driver and injuring the driver. Air raid alerts were also issued in the Russian Black Sea port of Novorossiysk.
Now, in a historic first, Pope Leo has delivered a sweeping political address to Spain's parliament, warning that rising global conflicts and polarization have pushed the world into profound crisis. The pontiff fiercely opposed rising European military spending and urged leaders to prioritize diplomacy. Turning to global migration, he framed the crisis as not just a political challenge, but as a direct test of human morality.
The tragic drama of migration challenges the conscience of nations and the ethical foundation of the international order. Numerous men, women and children are forced, often by dramatic circumstances, to leave their communities and abandon loved ones, histories and bonds. The situation of migrants and refugees demands a response that looks at the people, addresses the causes that force them to leave, and goes beyond the mere management of flows. From this arises a dual requirement of social justice: to provide safe and legal pathways, respectful reception, and real possibilities for integration, and at the same time to promote the right to remain in one's own land.
The French National Assembly's Legal Commission has approved a draft bill that would grant the island of Corsica a special autonomous status within the French Republic. The move aims to address decades of cultural and political demands from the island. However, there's already a fierce debate over national unity.
France's Legal Commission has approved a landmark draft bill titled Corsica's Right to Special Autonomy. If passed, the constitutional amendment will grant the island self-governance, officially recognizing its unique cultural and linguistic heritage. Under the new framework, the local assembly, the Collectivité de Corse, can adapt national regulations to fit local economic needs. However, all regional laws must strictly align with the French constitution and international law, leaving essential state powers with Paris. The move has sharply divided lawmakers. Right-wing Republicans strongly oppose the bill, arguing it threatens national unity. Meanwhile, left-wing Liberal parties and Corsican representatives support it as a necessary step for self-determination. The full National Assembly is scheduled to vote on the bill on June 24th, which will determine the future of Corsica's administrative status.
All right, after the break, we'll examine whether Ukraine's latest long-range drone operations has altered the strategic calculus of the war as President Volodymyr Zelensky meets the leaders of Britain, France and Germany in London. Stay with us. Welcome back to Way News. Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has met with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz in London as European leaders discuss support for Ukraine and the prospect of future negotiations with Russia. Joining us now is Andrei Dobransky, Director of Communications at the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, joining us from New York. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Hi, thank you for having me back on.
Now, Ukrainian commanders are now speaking openly about how easily they struck Russia. What message is Kyiv trying to pass?
Well, we call them in Ukraine our area sanctions, and they're a two-way system of putting pressure onto Russia. One is the European and American and Western sanctions regime that limits the amount of material that Russia is able to purchase from the West. And the more that the Ukrainians are able to get deeper into Russia, attack oil processing facilities, this is oil that has already been sanctioned, they are able to diminish the ability of those facilities to produce oil. And because of the Western sanctions that I earlier mentioned, they're not able to purchase replacement parts to get those facilities back up and running. And that's the dual pressure to force Russia to the negotiating table.
Now, has Ukraine exposed a military or psychological weakness inside Russia?
Over the last couple of months specifically, we're hearing much more from Russian bloggers, whether they're military bloggers or everyday bloggers in Petersburg and Moscow, demonstrating the real costs of Ukraine's victories on the front line, where Russia has lost territory this year, much more so than it has in the previous 2 years. And then also the long-range drones affecting everyday life. Many airports being closed down for hours or days at a time now because of the threat of Ukrainian troops circling them. So this is where now we are seeing and hearing from Russian citizens directly that they feel the cost of war, a cost of war that has led to nearly over a million casualties. That's just not people who are deceased, but people who are injured as well, of their own citizens. And they haven't been talking about it up until they have actually seen the drones in their own cities.
Now, do you think these attacks strengthen Ukraine's negotiating position or complicate the path to talks?
No, again, because these are done on a very targeted level at military facilities, as well as targeting those oil-producing facilities that the Western world has decided should be off the market. That is what Ukraine is striking. In contrast, you had Russia striking the Chernobyl nuclear facility just this week, as well as multiple times during this conflict. You have Russia sending Shahed drones as well as ballistic missiles into civilian centers. Just 2 weeks ago, 2 8,000-pound bombs, these missiles, the Oreshniks, were sent directly into the heart of a civilian area in Kyiv. This is not what Ukraine is doing. Ukraine is doing targeted military strikes and therefore keeping in the good graces of its Western partners who want to see Ukraine prevail in this conflict with the support that they're giving them.
Now, why was it important for Ukraine to carry out this operation before Zelensky's meeting with European leaders?
Oh, well, it's a demonstration of exactly the capabilities Ukraine has. They are striking deeper and further into Russia than they were able to last year. And it's not just the development of single drones, but drones that can piggyback off of other drones. And then most famously, the operation we saw, Operation Spiderweb last year, where Ukraine sent in months beforehand containers that had drones inside. They were able to be transported in commercial trucking, and then those drones were able to be exposed. This exposes Russia's weakness in terms of its security, but it's also demonstrating to the rest of NATO what they need to prepare for. And this is why that you have countries like Estonia canceling contracts for older military mechanized vehicles, like infantry fighting vehicles, and turning their budget priorities towards detecting drones and counter-drone systems.
Now, the Kremlin quickly rejected the proposal for a face-to-face meeting, even though it was backed by the EU leaders. Did these intense cross-border strikes give Moscow the perfect excuse to walk away?
Well, Russia has been not sitting at the table this entire time. So the one thing we're seeing from Ukraine is wherever President Trump or the Western allies say, let's have a meeting, it's President Zelensky who's almost the first one on the plane to get there. We saw this very famously when President Trump asked both President Putin and President Zelensky to meet in Turkey in May of 2025. President Zelensky flew there. Then it was decided it would be a meeting of the foreign ministers. The foreign minister of Ukraine, Zhubiha, flew there and was ready for the meeting. In the end, it wasn't at the level of the foreign ministry. So it's very clear which side is willing to sit face to face, even at the expense of being insulted by the Russian side, where they have called out numerous times in their face-to-face meetings that the people on the other side, the Ukrainian negotiators, have lost family members. They know exactly where those family members have been lost due to Russian missiles. Ukraine is still ready and willing to live up to their part that they have promised to their Western interlocutors to sit across from the Russian side.
Yeah, but do you think these attacks strengthen Ukraine's negotiating position or complicate these paths? Or I've asked you that question. I was going to ask you about Zelensky's position of vulnerability or position of strength following these attacks.
Yeah, well, again, I will go to my first answer about the two-pronged approach. It's not Ukraine attacking by itself. Ukraine is attacking positions where Russians cannot replace materials without purchasing items from the West. And those items are blocked because of Western sanctions. So the West isn't willing to attack Russia. Ukraine is. The West controls the ability to block their ability to purchase weapons, materials to fix their facilities. And this is the only way we get back to my last answer, which is Ukraine is ready to sit at the table across, and Russia is not. So this pressure, this is what Zelensky is constructing here. He's constructing pressure for Putin to finally relent and sit across the table.
Now, if Ukraine can repeatedly demonstrate reach inside Russia, does that now alter how Europe thinks about long-term support?
Well, what Europe could have done is it could have given them intermediate range missiles that were loaded onto airplanes. That's just something that was being advocated for a long time, either the Storm Shadows or the Tauruses from Germany. But Ukraine has replaced these with not only its longer range drones, but its intermediate range Flamingo rocket as well. In the end, what Ukraine is asking more than anything are defensive weapons from the West. It is asking for Patriot missile batteries first and foremost because of the attack of the ballistic missiles. The last 2 weeks, we have had these hundreds and sometimes over 1,000 Shahed drones come into over Ukrainian airspace, and we are seeing shoot-down rates of over 92% on a regular basis. So Ukraine is intercepting drones very easily. It is as I mentioned before, many thousand-pound ballistic missiles that are being fired on Ukraine. That Ukraine needs the Patriot system at this point.
Now, what does this now tell us about the operations, or what does this say about operations, about the current state of Russian air defenses?
Well, this is actually a demonstration of all nations' air defenses. First and foremost, Ukraine's air defenses. Nobody was prepared for accepting hundreds and hundreds of drones being launched at your country every day. Ukraine had to develop the first ever system for detecting them, understanding what direction they're traveling in, and trying to figure out next how to intercept them. And that's something that Ukraine has developed. No other nation really is at the level of doing this, including Russia. So the question about whether Russia is able to defend, Ukraine is the only country that has been under attack so readily that they have been forced to develop systems. And this is something that now other European or Middle Eastern or other allies of Ukraine are now asking for that technology, because as Russia ramps up, as China, as Iran ramps up the production of these drones, the West and its allies need to be ready for that.
Andre, thank you very much for sharing your time and insights with us.
Thank you so much.
All right, after the break, we'll take a closer look at the key stories shaping the region. Stay with us.
And welcome to Primetime. What a show we've got lined up for you today. In a complex world, clarity is power. Two hours live, diplomacy dissected in a spin-free environment. That's Prime Time with me, Guy Schoen, weekdays on A News.
Welcome back to A News. Now, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has secured another term in office after his party won parliamentary elections in Armenia. The result is expected to allow him to form a government without a coalition, while key questions remain over peace talks with Azerbaijan and Armenia's relations with Russia and the West.
Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan is set to remain in office after his civil contract party won the country's parliamentary election. Pashinyan called the result a historic victory and said civil contract would form the next government on its own.
On June 7, 2026, the elections to the National Assembly took place. As a result of the elections, the Civil Contract Party won. And the Civil Contract Party will single-handedly form the government.
The Commission said civil contract won 49.81% of the vote. Strong Armenia came second with 23.29%, followed by Armenia Alliance with 9.94%. Prosperous Armenia also entered parliament with 4%. Turnout stood at around 59%, with nearly 1.5 million people casting ballots out of more than 2.5 million registered voters. Civil contract's share of the vote is enough to form the next government under Armenia's electoral rules. The party is expected to hold a slim parliamentary majority, allowing it to govern without a coalition. Pashinyan campaigned on moving ahead with peace talks with Azerbaijan, deepening ties with the West and maintaining relations with Russia. The opposition accused him of making concessions to Baku and weakening Armenia's ties with Moscow. Russia increased pressure on Yerevan before the vote, including through trade restrictions and warnings over Armenia's closer ties with Europe. The result gives Pashinyan a renewed mandate to pursue a final peace deal with Azerbaijan. But civil contract does not appear to have secured the two-thirds majority needed for constitutional changes that Azerbaijan says are required before a final agreement can be signed. For the South Caucasus, the result keeps Armenia on a more pro-Western path, while leaving key questions over its relations with Russia and the future of peace talks with Azerbaijan.
As Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan secured victory in the parliamentary elections, congratulations poured in from across the region and Europe. The messages highlighted not only support for Pashinyan's leadership, but also growing expectations about Armenia's future ties with the European Union.
Regional leaders were among the first to congratulate Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan as vote counting continued following Sunday's parliamentary elections. Georgian Prime Minister Irakli Kobakidze welcomed the result and said he looks forward to strengthening strategic ties between Georgia and Armenia. Kazakh President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev also congratulated Pashinyan, citing preliminary assessments by international observers that the vote was conducted openly and in accordance with electoral laws. Among European leaders, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the result was also a victory for Armenia's sovereignty and independence. French President Emmanuel Macron said Pashinyan's victory would strengthen momentum toward closer ties with Europe. Moldovan President Maya Sandu and Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez were also among the leaders sending congratulatory messages. Senior European Union officials likewise welcomed the result. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said the EU deeply values its partnership with a democratic Armenia that is drawing ever closer to Europe, adding that Armenia can count on the bloc's support. European Council President Antonio Costa and European Parliament President Roberta Metsola also congratulated Pashinyan, underscoring continued European engagement with Armenia following the closely watched vote.
The United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan has raised concerns over reports that several women have been arrested in Herat for allegedly failing to follow hijab and dress regulations. Tami Bahis has more from Kabul.
UNAMA has expressed concern over what it describes as multiple arrests and detentions of women in Herat in western Afghanistan. According to the UN's mission, the women were reportedly detained for alleged non-compliance with dress requirements, including hijab regulations. In its statement, UNAMA said these reports raise serious human rights concerns. The mission also reminded the de facto authorities that all people have the right to freedom of movement. It added that women and men are equally entitled to equality before the law. So far, Afghan authorities have not issued any comment on the reported arrests in Herat or on UNAMA's statement. The issue of women's rights and restrictions on women's public life has remained a major concern in Afghanistan, with international organizations repeatedly calling for the protection of basic freedoms. For now, UNAMA says it is concerned about the reported detentions and is urging respect for fundamental rights, including freedom of movement and equal treatment under the law. Tamim Bahis in Kabul, A News.
Now, Georgians may lose their visa-free access to Europe. This comes as Brussels activate a formal suspension mechanism against Georgia and called Georgian officials to a dialogue meeting on June 11th. Our correspondent Nina Nikolashvili has more.
Millions of Georgian citizens could lose the right to travel to Europe without a visa, and the clock is ticking. The meeting on June 11 is taking place under the suspension mechanism Brussels activated against Georgia in March, a decision that already stripped holders of Georgian diplomatic service and official passports of their travel rights until March 2027. The Commission also introduced enhanced screening of all Georgian citizens at EU borders, with checks running across European databases, including the Visa Information System, the Schengen Information System, and the Entry-Exit System, rolled out across the EU last October. The latest EU report under the mechanism makes clear why Brussels is alarmed. Georgia has fulfilled almost none of its recommendations. The Commission points to Tbilisi granting visa-free access to Chinese citizens in 2024, maintaining arrangements with 26 countries whose nationals need visas to enter the EU, and allowing entry to citizens of 17 others solely on the basis of Gulf Cooperation Consul permits. Brussels called this backsliding systematic and deliberate. The Georgian government sees it differently. Parliament Speaker Nikol Pashinyan described the June 11 meeting as technical rather than political and accused Brussels of imposing conditions that go beyond visa liberalization criteria and infringe on Georgian sovereignty. He pushed back against EU expectations that Georgia join sanctions against Russia and scrap its foreign agents law. But Georgian opposition parties and civil society organizations strongly reject that framing, holding the government itself responsible for the country's deteriorating relationship with the European Union. The road ahead has clear milestones. In December, the Commission publishes its next annual report, and in January 2027, EU member states may vote on whether to maintain or fully suspend visa-free travel for all Georgian citizens, a right that Georgians have held since 2017. Nini Nikolashvili, Tbilisi, A News.
Now, a major water infrastructure project is set to launch in southern Kyrgyzstan, where access to clean drinking water remains a challenge for many in rural communities. Authorities say the initiative could improve living conditions for thousands of people in the Osh region. Our correspondent Farza Kalimoziner has more.
Nearly 158,000 people in southern Kyrgyzstan could soon gain access to clean drinking water after authorities reached an agreement on financing for a major infrastructure project in the Osh region, following talks with the Eurasian Fund for Stabilization and Development. The project will cover 32 villages in the Karasu and Uzgen districts, where many residents still rely on unsafe water sources or aging water systems built from the 1950s through to the 1980s. The problem is especially acute in the Osh region, one of the most densely populated areas of Kyrgyzstan. Access to safe drinking water here is estimated at around 65%, leaving many rural communities without reliable supply. Under the agreement, the Eurasian Fund for Stabilization and Development will provide a $60 million loan. The total cost of the project is estimated at $66.7 million, with the Kyrgyz side contributing $6.7 million through co-financing. The deal is expected to be signed by the end of June 2026, with the implementation planned over the next 5 years. And according to official figures, Kyrgyzstan has more than 2,000 villages, and 405 of them still lack access to drinking water. The country's Ministry of Water Resources says most of these villages are located in the south, particularly in the Osh, Jalalabad and Batken regions. Fariza Kalimurzina, Almaty, A News.
Uzbekistan and Russia have discussed expanding cooperation in agriculture, food security and energy during a series of meetings held on the sidelines of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. Our correspondent, Severa Rajapova, brings us more from Tashkent.
Agriculture and energy were among the key topics discussed by Uzbek and Russian officials at the St. Petersburg's International Economic Forum. Deputy Prime Minister Jamshid Khojayev met with Russian Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Patrushev to discuss the further development of cooperation in agriculture and food security. Russia remains one of Uzbekistan's key partners in the sector, with bilateral trade in agricultural and food products reaching $2.3 billion in 2025. In the first quarter of this year alone, trade exceeded $500 million. Particular attention was paid to stable agricultural supplies, veterinary and phytosanitary cooperation, and maintaining favorable conditions for the import of socially important goods and raw materials. The sides agreed to introduce a new quarantine control mechanism, strengthen monitoring of orchards and farmland, and conduct regular inspections to ensure uninterrupted trade. Energy cooperation also featured prominently on the agenda. During talks with Russian Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak, the parties reviewed supplies of crude oil and petroleum products, including petrol, aviation fuel and feedstock for oil refineries, as well as broader issues of energy security. The meeting came shortly after President Shavkat Mirziyoyev and Vladimir Putin officially launched construction of the first power unit of Uzbekistan's integrated nuclear power plant in Jizakh region. The project, valued at $9.5 billion, will include 4 power units and is scheduled to be commissioned between 2029 and 2035. Russia will support the project through a preferential export loan, while Rosatom will supply nuclear fuel and provide technical support. In addition, meetings were held with the leadership of Gazprom, Rosneft and Gazprom Oil to discuss gas supplies, energy security and prospects for future joint projects. It is Severa Rajapova reporting from Tashkent, Uzbekistan, A News.
All right, after the break, we'll discuss Armenia's election and its implication for the future of the South Caucasus. Stay with us. Welcome back to A News. Now, Armenia's parliamentary election delivered a clear victory for Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan and his civil contract party, securing another mandate at a time of significant regional and geopolitical change. With the campaign now over, attention is turning to what comes next, from relations with Russia and the West to the peace process with Azerbaijan and the expectations facing a government that has promised stability, reform and continued regional engagement. Joining us now is Associate Professor Orhan Valiev, Head of Department at Kazakh University, joining us from Baku. Thank you for joining us, sir.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for the kind invitation.
Now, what do the elections results generally mean for from Azerbaijan's perspective?
Yes, it was the historic election in the history of the Republic of Armenia, so which has some interest of Azerbaijan as well, because of the ongoing peace process in 2 countries. First of all, I have to mention that Pashinyan won the election, first of all, due to the new context of the region, not just country, that has been shaped by the Second Karabakh War. For example, it is due to the new current the context of the region. The irredentist, the policy won't be able to come to the agenda of the country. I mean, Armenia again, because we are not living in the 20th century at the end of the last 20th century. So when we experienced the different context. So first, it is, I think, clear. The main consideration from Azerbaijan is that contribution to the peace process. So, because there was some opposition sides during the process, the campaign process, so that they promoted the irredentist nationalist policy that could have eliminated achievements over the last 5 years regarding the peace process, peace negotiation. So, therefore, I think the issue is that the Armenian citizens, the one elected the government who proposed the Armenia within its the territory, which is recognized as international law, and they proposed the recognition of the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan, which is the gap between two countries in terms of the peace process. So now it is, I think, time to focus on the next process in terms of the signing of the final peace agreements between two countries. So Azerbaijan's the main to focus on this, the Pashinyans, the government and its reaction to the process.
Now let's bring in Russia into the equation. Moscow invested considerable political attention in this election. Now, what conclusions is the Kremlin likely drawing from the results?
You know, in terms of the former context of the region, not Armenia, the Russia dominated the context. But however, first of all, Azerbaijan, won the Second Karabakh War and proposed the peace process. So Azerbaijan became a full-fledged sovereign state in its the recognized territory. So and then we started to have new engagements in terms of Turkey, in terms of EU, in terms of the U.S. engagement. The finalization, the process of U.S. engagement was in Washington last year, right? So it was considered by both leaders, as President Ilham Aliyev, Prime Minister Pashinyan, that the starting time of the de facto peacetime between two countries. Therefore, we have the new engagements in the region, and also we have some regional and global context, new context that Russia they won't be able to dominate or insist its the hegemonic the policy or interest in the region in terms of Armenia. Therefore, I think it's not possible. So all the sides will have to integrate to the new reality that started right after the Second Karabakh War and culminated in Washington, D.C. last year.
Now, what does the opposition's second place finish tell us about the depth of public dissatisfaction within Armenia's political status quo?
It tells us that the ordinary Armenian citizens elected him as the prime minister that will be able to organize the government, new government. But however, the election result tells us that he will have to maybe just work on the new the issues in terms of some change on the constitution. So therefore, it seems that he will have a little bit the challenge in his society. We will see because of the result of the election. Because the results has 2 points. His government, his team will be able to be just the full the government. But however, in terms of the constitutional change, which is critically important in terms of the peace process, and also implementation of the projects, including the corridor, Trip Road. So therefore, I think the results has 2 the points. But I think it's normal. It's not the huge surprise.
Now let's bring it back to Azerbaijan. How do you think Pashinyan can move forward with peace treaties like with Baku when he does not have enough majority for the constitutional change needed?
I think, by the way, we have some positive the reactions from Pashinyan sides during the May the European summit, and also after the elections at his press conference. So it is just positive the reactions that from his side. However, we should focus on the implementation time that maybe will be a little bit difficult and not easy, because as I emphasized at the beginning, the context is different, which is not easy. So we are going to just witness implementation process, which is critically important. So the Azerbaijan's the focus on the change on constitution that will facilitate the signing of the final peace between two countries, and signing of the final peace agreements between two countries will facilitate and contribute to the establishment of or implementation of the further projects. Because, if you remember, right after the Washington summit, Prime Minister Pashinyan said that the process that will make the region a transit the country that will bring the prosperity to our countries. So it seems that yes, they bear in mind these benefits of the process. So now that time is just the implementation. So he should focus on the new government will have to focus on the convincement of the society, or just let's say the parties at the parliament, the change on the constitution, which is critically important, because the Pashinyan's campaign was based on the Armenians' real territory. He tried to show the people that we have the certain territory which is recognized by the international law. So the Karabakh is part of the Azerbaijan, which is recognized by the international law. So it was the quite another positive the points. Now it's time to implement these the proposals.
Now, currently, the vote cast for the Prosperous Armenia Party are being recounted. If the party reaches the 4% threshold, the 64 seats provisionally allocated to the civil contract could be reduced to 61, depriving them of absolute majority. How important is that?
Actually, it is a new the reality to the Armenian politics. Actually, over the last it's the independence times, because first of all, it's not a snap election, as which has been emphasized by the many experts. So this is an historic election, right? So that brought the new things, new experience to the Armenian politics. So the Prime Minister Pashinyan will have to try to do that, including just the 4% will be maybe will be the critically important to the process in the coming months. So while focusing on the process, I mean, just the peace process, constitutional change. So therefore, it is a new reality to the Armenian politics, so that they will start to experience this right after the election.
That was Associate Professor Orhan Valiev, Head of Department from Kazakh University, joining us from Baku. Thank you for your time, sir.
Pleasure.
All right, that was all we have for now. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to A News.